All right, so now we come to our closing keynote, and I'm really excited because, well, the closing keynote was our previous year's opening keynote. That's the Chrome extensions team, and I'm really, really glad to have Devlin Cronin from the Chrome extensions team. He's the tech lead and manager of Chrome extensions. We have Karan Bhatia, software engineer. We have Alexander Blondin, product manager for the Chrome extensions consumer experience, and then we have David Lee, product manager, Chrome extensions, developer experience. I'm sure everyone will have a lot of questions, so let's just dive in to the talk, and then afterwards we'll have questions. Let's go.
Okay. Hi, everyone.
Hey, everyone.
Thank you for tuning in to our talk. My name is David Lee, and I'm the product manager for the Chrome extension developer experience. Today, you'll be hearing from a number of our other members of the Chrome extensions team. You can see them here now, on how Chrome is thinking about advancing the extensions ecosystem. All right. So before we get started and dive into all the exciting things that we've been working on, I want to talk a little bit about our team's philosophy surrounding extensions and the principles that we've been fundamentally focusing on recently. First, I'm starting from basics. So Chrome is a browser, and people rely on Chrome to browse the ever-changing content on the web. And Chrome extensions allow users to take control of their browsing experience. Chrome users rely on extensions for a wide variety of different purposes, from sifting through unwanted ads, or finding the best deals when shopping, or taking advantage of the best tools for being productive. For many people across the world, Chrome extensions allow them to make the browser truly theirs. And for the extensions team, for us, this year was all about privacy and security. Just as ad blockers protect against potentially intrusive ads and content on the web, Chrome also protects users from potentially harmful or unsafe extensions. Later on, you'll hear about recent and upcoming changes that we're making in our platform and API surface, our UX, and our policies in our continued commitment to user safety. To better understand how those efforts play a role in the larger picture of the extensions ecosystem, it's useful to have some context on how we think about the extensions flow in general. So we see extensions as having two major stakeholders, the developer and the user. And we believe that everything is connected in a cycle. Starting in the top left, developers build extensions and then distribute them through the web store. Users discover those extensions, install them, run them, and then come to love them. Their usage and feedback then go back into the cycle and help the developer figure out how to improve their extension and motivate the developer to make the extensions even better and better. And so in accordance with that model, in accordance with that cycle, we've made a number of different changes across the board this year. We've been making tweaks and improvements to Manifest v3 in preparing for its launch. We've been rethinking extensions UX to keep users more informed. And we've been updating, and we've updated our Chrome Web Store policies and are updating them more to better keep our store safe and high quality. You'll soon hear about these changes in more detail, but just as important to be aware of is that all of these changes share a common underlying philosophy. And that is the idea that facilitating a transparent and trustworthy experience for our users is fundamental for creating a thriving extensions ecosystem. Our push for safety and privacy will foster greater user trust in extensions, and users who trust in extensions and in Chrome's web store will discover, install, run, and come to love extensions as a whole more and more. Ultimately, our users are your users. A trustworthy Chrome, a trustworthy extensions platform, and a trustworthy store is not only great for Chrome's users, but it's also inherently beneficial, we believe, to our developer community as a whole. And with that, I want to introduce one of the biggest things that we've been working on this year, which should not come as a surprise for this audience, and that's Manifest v3. Just as a refresher, let me briefly go over the goals of Manifest v3 and the major changes from v2. So Manifest v3 is a collection of changes that aims at a number of different goals. Manifest v3 is meant to be more privacy preserving, more secure, performant. It should align more with the modern web, and it's more capable than Manifest v2. There are a number of things changing, but the major changes from v2 to be aware of are: 1, declarative net request is replacing parts of web request. 2, we're moving from background pages to a service worker-based architecture. And 3, we're disallowing remotely hosted code. For the ad blocking community, we know that the first of these changes, the addition of declarative net request, is a topic of significant interest. So now I'll hand it off to Karen to talk about the recent changes to declarative net request that we've made as a result of your feedback.
Hey everyone, so this is Karan. I've been the lead engineer on declarative net request, or DNR. So yeah, so the declarative net request API, as you may know, is an extension API which allows extensions to block or redirect requests or to modify headers. So it's declarative in the sense that the extensions specify rules to modify network requests instead of modifying the request programmatically. So what's special about the API is that DNR allows for privacy-preserving content blocking. It is privacy-preserving since the request details are not shared with the extension, unlike web request blocking, which is what the content blockers use today. So this API is intended to serve as a replacement for the content blocking capabilities of web request blocking in Manifest v3. And it's already launched to stable in M84, so feel free to give it a try. Yes, so why did we introduce a new API? So Rob from Firefox actually did go over some of these points as well. Our primary motivation has been the privacy and security of the users. With DNR, extensions don't need access to the request to block or upgrade them. Since DNR doesn't need host permissions for some of its functionality, it's also more compatible with runtime host permissions, where the user can selectively withhold extensions access to certain sites. Since most of what the extension does is specified in the extension package itself, it also provides for easier static analysis for us. Another one of the goals of the API has been performance. The API is more compatible with service workers, since we don't need to respawn the service worker again and again for each request. This is because the evaluation logic happens directly in the browser process without invoking the extension. Process. This also in turn means that we don't need a permanent background process, thus saving more memory as well. So unlike web request blocking with DNR, the browser doesn't need to wait for all the extensions as well to run their JavaScript logic for each request. Compared to web request blocking, DNR can help reduce as much as 6 IPC calls or inter-process communication calls for a single request. Also, since the browser is in control of the rule evaluation, we can fine-tune the implementation based on real-world data. And this will automatically have a good impact on all the extensions using the API. So since I went over this API last year at the summit as well, this time I'll instead go over some of the improvements that we have made to the API since the last summit. A lot of these improvements have been a direct result of the feedback from extension developers and the ad blocking community. For example, some of the extensions present here today did share a feedback doc with us last year as well, which has been really useful and directly impacted some of these features. So first of all, let me describe multiple static rule sets. With multiple static rule sets, extensions can specify multiple rule sets as part of the extension package. The extension can also selectively enable or disable these rule sets. This can be useful for shipping region or language-specific rule sets to the users. This was one of the requests from the last year's summit as well. We've also implemented support for regular expression rules and redirects to take care of the cases where the filter list format is not expressive enough. Again, this was one of the requests from various content blockers, since some of them do use regex rules in certain cases. Next, we added support for declarative header modification to the API. We also added multiple feedback APIs. These include the ability to automatically batch the extension icon with the action count on the tab, something a lot of content blockers already do. Similarly, extensions can use the Git match rules API to get a list of all the match rules on the tab. In one of the talks before, Andrew mentioned that debugging rule sets has been a problem for filter list orders with the content blocking mechanism on Safari. So to take care of cases like those, we introduced a new event called on rules match debug, which is triggered each time an action matches. This will be available to extensions under the unpacked extension mode and will aid filter list orders to debug their rule sets. Next, we also added support for an action called allow all requests. This allows the extension to allow list a frame hierarchy. Basically, if the request for a frame matches an allow all requests rule, no further rules will match inside the frame hierarchy. So one of the common use cases for this would be this would enable the user to disable their content blocker on a particular site. Those familiar with filter lists will also notice that this can be used to implement $document style exception rules. And this was also one of the concerns that ad blockers and content blockers had, and we implemented this after hearing their feedback. Lastly, we also implemented support for a more flexible priority system. This will allow extensions more control over how rule matching would be performed by the browser. So if you have been following the Chromium extensions Google group or a bug tracker, you know that we are always receptive to feedback and amenable to changing our stance in light of new information. So I'd encourage you all to try out the new API and give us feedback by filing bugs or feature requests. So finally, we are still working on a couple of new things. This includes a more generous rule limit that will be globally shared between all the installed extensions using DNR. So taking a step back, why do we need rule limits? We do want to provide certain performance guarantees to our users. So we do need some kind of a limit, and a global limit shared between all extensions helps us also in discouraging extensions from getting away with individual limits by publishing multiple extensions to the show. One thing to note is that each installed extension will still get a minimum allocation rule count so that it can work deterministically out of the box, irrespective of the presence of other extensions. We are also adding support for session scope rules, which are not persisted to disk. Instead, they will only be backed in memory. This will be useful for privacy-sensitive extensions, especially since dynamic rules can correspond to the user's browsing history. So apart from the platform changes upcoming in Manifest v3, we have also been making a lot of improvements to the general UX for extensions. So Alex will be talking over some of these changes and the related issues.
Thank you, Karen. Hi, everyone. My name is Alex, and I work as a PM on the Google team to focus about the needs of our consumers, so our Chrome users in general. And I'd like to invite you actually to step into the feet into the average user. And the interesting thing that we've learned about the average user is that they tend to want to accomplish a certain goal where they're in their browser. And that is really the thing they like to focus on. And it doesn't really, like I would say, the more we try to inform them of consequences of the goal they try to achieve, we can do that through confirmation dialogues, disclaimer, warning, and consent notice. But as Luisa mentioned today in her talk, content interruption is something users don't really like. And the more focused they are on their goal, the more they desire it, the more this confirmation dialogue and disclaimers start to blur and be ignored. So the interesting thing, if I bring it back to how extensions tend to, I would say, ask permissions and how the whole flow works today, it usually looks something like this, right? Say I'm a user and I want to install Google Keep the Chrome extension one, I will get prompted and it will tell me that the extension can read and change all my data on the website I visit, and it will know my email address. And maybe that's a trade-off that I'm willing to do because I think that Google Keep is just that great. But in general, those are pretty important permissions. But as we've observed is, if a user is tunnel focused on the goal, the permission dialog can start to morph into something that looks more like this. And can I complete your goal? Some text I may be tempted to ignore, and I will click right straight to where I learned to click, which is always the bottom right corner. So that brings us to a very important concept, which is what is consent and how can we do a better job than what we do today? How can we further improve the experience that Google provides? And I'd like to focus on two main topics. One is a concept of notice. And a good notice is usually done within context, right? When I'm about to do something, having the consequence laid out very clear in that context is crucially important. Having it serve all at once is less good of a notice. The second aspect is control. Control should be specific and revocable. If you think about it, like there may be around those two permissions, one I'm more comfortable with than the other, and that may come to the cost of some feature. And maybe I'm willing to do that trade-off. Maybe I'm not. And again, revocable, it's not because I said yes, an extension can access all my data today, that I mean yes every day until the end of time. The ability for a user to easily change their mind should be also put front and center. So with that, we may be thinking, well, how can we achieve this? Well, Google has done that actually already across many of their products. And probably one of the most notable one is on the world of mobile, where there was a shift from install time permission to what they call runtime permission. And in that case, instead of accepting every single permission at once to get the app, the permission request would happen when the feature that needs the data would actually be used. That ensure that like the context is clear to the user, but also the user can choose to be specific and revoke what they don't want. Now you may be thinking, well, that's all great. Let's just do the same thing for extension. And on every single web page I visit, I can just pop a dialog and say, do you want to share, permission with this page? Next page, show the same thing again. And I think in today's talk, Heather had a pretty good point, is that repetitive intrusion actually is not the greatest user experience in general. We've seen it with ads. It's not great for ads. And that's kind of the same example here. And also, I think if you look at some OSs that came out in the mid-2000s, asking for permission for something all the time is basically training the user to ignore the request. You're training the user to click the bottom right icon over and over and over. So every time it becomes less and less meaningful. So how do we go about solving this? Well, unlike apps, extensions are designed to extend something else. And that's the crucial part that makes the extension platform so complex, right? Apps are a destination in themselves. Extensions are not. You browse the web and you bring the extensions along. And that makes that shared context especially challenging. So for that, I kind of want to hand it off to Devlin, who will walk us through some of the changes we've made and how we think about those progress towards more meaningful consent.
Thanks, Alex. So Alex really ran us through how runtime permissions work well on apps because they're their own destination, but that doesn't quite apply to extensions the same way. So let's go ahead and actually take a deeper dive into some of the UI that we've had in the past, because this is one of the questions that we actually get a lot is how do we look at the different UIs? How do we evaluate them? When we're changing Chrome UI, what do we take into account? And how do we balance out these different needs? So we're going to dive into each of these in a little bit more detail, but just as a rough timeline, here are some of the major steps in extension UIs over the course of Chrome. So back in 2015, if you had an extension, it could declare a browser action in its manifest, or a page action or no action. And if it had a browser action, it would be persistently visible in the toolbar. But if it had a page action or no action, it wouldn't be. There might be no indication that that extension was actually installed and running on sites. In 2016, we introduced a persistent icon. We basically said that extensions are powerful enough. They solve enough use cases, but also have enough access to data that users should really make sure that they're aware that they're there and that we're presenting them as being a part of the browser. And so with that, we added this persistent icon on the toolbar. Fast forward to 2018, and we introduced these host permission controls, which really gave more power to the user and put them more in charge of their data. And then finally, in 2020, we launched the extensions menu, which was pretty recent. And that is a step further in that direction. So let's go ahead and dive into some of these with a little bit more detail. So starting in 2015, like I said, we had extensions, and they had a lot of the same capabilities they had today, where an extension might request access to all your data on the sites. It might be injecting JavaScript on every page or looking at every network request. And we all know that extensions are great and solve all of these different use cases. They allow you to browse the web in peace and block all of these annoying ads. They also allow you to have a VPN at your fingertips or enable accessibility use cases, provide more developer tools. They're fantastic, and they provide so much benefit to our users. But they're also really powerful because of that permission that Alex mentioned, of that it can read and change all the data on the sites you visit. And having that in conjunction with having so little visual presence in the browser was not really the right balance that we wanted to strike, because we wanted to make sure that users were consistently aware that these extensions were involved in their browser. And so that's what really led us to this first toolbar redesign in 2016. Next, thank you. And this was really just a focus on transparency. So instead of having the extension able to opt out of being visible to the user, all extensions had to have a visual presence. But at the same time, Chrome has a very strong stance on its UI that it should be simple, that it should be clean. If you look back at the browsers of the early 2000s, there were a lot more toolbars, there were a lot more buttons, and it really got a little bit cluttered. And we knew on Chrome we didn't want to take too much step back towards that, because we didn't think that that was a good user experience. So we also wanted to figure out, how do we balance this transparency and this visibility to the user with also having a clean and simple UI and not penalizing people who have extensions, because we want people to have extensions. So we don't want it to take up that much space. And for that reason, we also added an overflow menu in the Chrome menu, where you could basically shove those extensions into the Chrome menu to get them off the toolbar if you actually knew that they were there and you were kind of a power user that was aware of the implications for them. And so this was a great step in the right direction for transparency, because now users can see the extensions they have installed. Great. So this definitely helps with some of that, addressing some of that tunnel vision that we had before, where we're just clicking yes, and maybe we're not entirely focused on what all of the different effects of this can be. But we wanted to go a step further, because transparency alone isn't enough. We also wanted control. We wanted to be able to empower users. In 2016, 2017, when you install an extension, you are basically given this ultimatum in the install prompt of, you can install the extension and grant it all the permissions and achieve your goal, as Alex was saying, or you cannot install the extension. And that ultimatum wasn't the right balance that we wanted to strike. Instead, we wanted to empower the user more and put them in charge of their data and when their extensions ran and how. And this was really what led to the idea of runtime host permissions. And we introduced in 2018 the first controls for host permissions, where users could say, don't let this extension run all the time. I'll choose when to run it as the user. It's my data. Let me go ahead and specify, even if this extension is installed, whether or not it can run. But this led to a lot of different UX challenges. As Alex was alluding to, we can't just pop up this interstitial every time the user navigates. That would be a completely horrible experience. We would drive everyone away from the web, and that's not something anyone wants. So instead, we tried to figure out, how do we present this in context in a non-obtrusive way to the user, so that extensions become tools in their tool belt, so that extensions become things that they can invoke when they want them, and that they know that they can use, but that they are still in charge of their data, and we are embracing that user agency aspect. And the first controls that we introduced for this were in the Chrome extensions page and in the context menu. And users could go in and choose to let extensions only run on click or only run on certain sites. And we saw some good usage of that, but it was still something that the users had to discover themselves. And it was very much a power user feature, because a lot of people wouldn't intuitively just go to the Chrome extensions page to tweak this. The other challenge that we had was, how do we present to users that these extensions want to run on the page? Because that's one of the most important things, is you have an extension, it can do something, it can provide you with benefit. How do we make sure that users know that, even if they've restricted that access? And unfortunately, we had a lot of challenges with this. And what we came up with as this first version was this wants to run treatment, an indication that the extension can do something. And what that treatment was basically a raised white circle on the toolbar. Unfortunately, that's not really intuitive. If you show a user a raised white circle and say, what does this mean? They might say, it means I can click it, which is a good step in the right direction. But it doesn't mean it's an extension that wants access to the site that I'm currently on, but doesn't have it. But if I click it, it'll have it. It's not really a logical leap that people can easily make. And so we were okay with this because users had to opt into this flow. The user had to explicitly say, I want to restrict access for this extension, and I will choose when to run it. And we said that, well, if they do that, they'll be able to make this leap more easily. But it wasn't something where we could do this for all users or really push users into this world. So we were kind of thinking, what can we do to change this? What can we do for next step? And that's when we realized we have a lot of these different challenges and considerations to take into account. And there's a lot of these different parts of the problem. Three of the main ones are that we're trying to balance transparency, simplicity, and utility. So we talked about transparency a lot, where we want users to understand, here are the extensions I have installed, here's where they're running, here's how they're running, and have control over that. But we also want a simple browser. We don't want something where there's 100 different controls to toggle and users get overwhelmed. We want Chrome to have a clean UI. We want users to be able to be immersed in the web, because that's why you go to the browser. You go to the browser for the web. But we also wanted to make sure that we're not sacrificing utility. Extensions enable all these wonderful use cases, and if no one uses them, that's terrible. So we want to make sure that we're providing that as well. But unfortunately, all of these are kind of tugging in different directions. If we increase transparency and utility, it means that simplicity goes out the window. If we increase simplicity and utility, maybe it's not as obvious when things are running and transparency goes down. On top of all of that, extensions are hugely customizable. If you just look at the icon in the toolbar, it can be different types of actions. It could have been a browser action or a page action, so enabled on different types of pages. Or it could have been a synthesized action where Chrome gave it that action, but it doesn't have anything. It was just there for transparency. It could be clickable or not, depending on whether the extension is enabled. It could have some badge text on it. The icon on it can change and have different colors. And trying to balance all of this, and then introducing yet another axis here, which is that access state, another axis, which is the access state of the extension, for whether it has access, wants access, or doesn't want access to the current site. Trying to balance all of that in this tiny 16 by 16 icon was hugely problematic. So we looked at, what can we do for some user research? What do users think of different UIs? What can we do to convey this information? Is the intention of this UI clear? But also, does it scale to all the different types of extensions that we have, all those different possible configurations? And we realized that 256 pixels is not enough to have all of that different information conveyed in a meaningful way where the intention is clear to the user. We needed more space. And with that, that's when we kind of revisited this idea of what would the UI look like if we wanted to have host permissions be optional from the get-go. If you're re-envisioning the extensions platform, how would we pursue this? And this is what led to the thinking of the extensions menu. The extensions menu was a way that it provided us with more space. We could actually use words to convey ideas, and words can sometimes be better than pictures, despite the old adage of a picture being worth 1,000 words. When you're trying to convey extension access and whether or not it can run on a site, sometimes using language is easier. The extensions menu also gave us a scalable way that we can present this information to the user, but also have it not immediately visible on the toolbar, not be cluttering their space, so that if their extensions are running as they want, if they configured that access control to be what they want, then they can be immersed in the web, because the web is the destination. And so with that, we introduced the extensions menu, and we brought those site access controls a little bit more front and center. Before, where they were buried in the extensions page or behind a context menu, now we call out explicitly in that menu, is the extension running? What type of access does it have? And let the user directly configure it based on that. That also lets us have more, present more visibility to the user in terms of when extensions can run and do they want to run on the current page. Of course, we're still not done with this. There's more to do, because this is still not entirely the world we want to be in. This is still a world where users have to always opt into this type of behavior, and it's a little bit hard to find, and it's not always immediately clear. And so we want to make sure that we're iterating on this design, that we're continuing to evolve it and research different aspects of it so that we can really embrace runtime host permissions and extensions and provide that benefit of privacy respecting secure extensions to everyone. And we also want to make sure that while we're doing that, we're not harming good extensions. We never want to penalize a good actor for enabling a different use case, for providing the user benefit. So making sure that we're striking that right balance throughout this process is one of the main considerations that we have. But we've talked a lot about how extensions are run and also with how extensions are built with Manifest v3. But there's one other part of this, which is how extensions are discovered and distributed. And a big part of that comes down to the policies that we have in extensions. And with that, I'll hand it back to Alex to talk a little bit about our approach to these policies.
Thank you, Devlin. So I want to ask a very simple question, which is, why do we have policy and what is the main goal that leads to that? Well, ideally, the goal of a policy is basically to keep harmful items out of the Chrome Web Store. And the way we like to think about it at Google when we think about enforcement is, ideally, the policy, which defines a set of rules of what is OK and not OK, should be documented publicly. And we should have clear and specific boundaries. And that's something at Google that is very important to us, because that transparency and that clarity levels the playing field for all developers, and it fosters an open ecosystem. We typically want to avoid the type of policy that kind of works like, the bouncer of a nightclub. Like, you don't want that idea that, someone's in, someone's out, and you don't really know why. So that's why that clarity is very important. But it comes with some drawback, because it also makes our enforcement tactics needing to be a lot more structured. So every policy needs to be, enforced using very tangible facts. We find facts about the extension, and then we can compare it to the policy and determine whether an item is compliant or not. So when I talk about limitation, there's one specific example that I think is very relevant to this crowd, which is the case of a helpful ad blocker against a harmful ad blocker. And for the sake of this example, we've made up an ad blocker. Let's call it FatBlock. And the way FatBlock works is that it started as using a lot of the common code, a lot of the shared tools, and so on. So it started out very similar to initial ad blockers. And thanks to the permission it has to access user data, at some point it decided to sell that user data and siphon user data and just monetize it in a way that's incompliant with the policy. When that sort of things happen, at Google, we take down the item immediately. Now, the interesting question when that happens is that usually the news write about it, and we get some questions, we get some feedback, and people wonder how come Google is not doing anything to prevent FatBlock from having done something bad in the first place? How come isn't there anything to prevent FatBlock from even existing on the web store? And that's the part that is very tricky. It would be very difficult for us to create a policy that is objective, public, and clear, that would basically guarantee that folks like FatBlock don't make it into the store at all, and all the other ad blockers that we come to know and love would remain. Because if we think about things like code similarity, a lot of the ad blockers out there have similarities in their code. That does not mean that they are harmful or being established, right? Everyone is not established until they are. So fundamentally, with the concept of FatBlock is that there isn't any objective criteria or characteristic about this fake ad blocker that makes it harmful until it is. And that's why prevention in this case can be extremely tricky. So bringing back to the idea here is that having policy enforced on objective and observable facts make it really tricky. And that is why, in general, policy is not a silver bullet. You cannot just count on policy to monitor all of the intent. It has to be grounded on something that is very objective. And the way we approach it usually is that we observe a type of harmful behavior, and we try to find characteristics about that behavior and see whether we can get rid of those possibilities or actions in a way that would prevent the harmful behavior and not harm the positive ecosystem as we're doing it. Of course, when Google launches a new policy, good developers rarely welcome it with open arms. And this seems like an appropriate time to quote High School Musical, but really, we are all in this together. Developers that don't welcome policy with open arms because it is increased work on their end. But that's also the case for us. When we launch a new policy, that also means we have to adjust our enforcement tactics. We need to build tools to detect those behaviors and so on. And everybody has to share that cost. But that short-term cost is really for the greater good of the whole ecosystem. And for that, I want to show you some history of the policy we've launched in the past couple of years and see how we can do objective policies and what are they good to fight against. So I'll focus not on all of those ones, but only a specific few ones. I think one of the most interesting and impactful policy that was launched in the past couple of years was deprecating the inline installation. The key idea here is that back in 2018, developers were able to host extension and basically have it installed from their website. The issue with that is we had no ability to control what the developer would say or the publisher would say about the extension itself. I could say, claim an extension does A on that website, you click install, and you have something that does something completely different. That was really hard for us to enforce against. And also, developers and users did not use the same, I would say, template to display information. So what we've done instead is basically make it mandatory for the user to visit the Chrome Web Store before, so that we can make sure that we can monitor what is being displayed to user. In 2019, we continued in that direction with the deceptive distribution policy. It's in the same line of idea. We want to remove the ability for developer to basically lie to the user to get installs. And the way it works with deceptive distribution was publishers were being held responsible for the advertisement or journey that precede the installation path. So for instance, if I were to buy an ad and create a landing page, the information that we've put in there had to be accurate. And the Chrome Web Store would be allowed to remove an extension if the information that led to the installation at any point was deemed inaccurate. Another policy we launched in 2019 was the minimum permission user data policy. And that was actually a Google-wide initiative. The main idea was we want to make sure that third-party developers, when they request access to data, they do it in a sensitive manner. They do it for the appropriate use case. And the idea behind that was every permission that's being requested has to be here to satisfy the core scenario. There should not be requests for permission that are unrelated to what the extension is trying to accomplish. And the last policy we launched was a couple months ago, is the spam 2.0 policy. We had an old spam policy, but we updated it. And it was around repetitive content. What we've observed is that a lot of malicious actors, what they would do in order to game the system and I would say get more clicks and visibility overall, is to post a lot of duplicate of the same extension. Can you imagine that you have an extension that would do one thing, and then you change the description and title enough that you can cover more and more keywords? And we would end up with malicious actor with hundreds of extensions that would basically doing the same thing, but they vary a little bit to make sure that they can get more clicks. And next, we'll have some more policy coming up, of course, because that's kind of an arm race with like malicious actor being more and more creative and us having to adapt. So an interesting point about new policies coming in is that it makes the whole review process more complex and heavier. And that's some feedback we heard from developers. And one of the reasons developers also don't welcome policies with open arms is that we all know that at some point someone needs to check whether the content of the policy is being respected or not. And then Google enforcement works on two pillars. We have an automatic process, so basically machines that are checking whether the item is compliant or not, but we actually also have human reviewers. Actually, a majority of extension goes through manual reviews if they, request sensitive permissions. And in order to have a good experience when you publish an extension and optimize for your review, really think about the reviewer as a real person. They're your partner in there. They're here to make sure that you make it to the store. So here are 3 pieces of advice to make the whole process a lot better. Number 1, high quality description and helpful assets. If the person who reviews your extension can immediately understand what you're trying to do, their job is a lot easier. They don't have to, dig through a description, no screenshot, and basically, try to guess what the extension is trying to accomplish. Second, just like within your own companies, you try to have readable code because someone else might pick up your code and have to work with it. Making sure that your code in your package is readable and well-maintained will make the whole process a lot faster because, again, a real person is looking at your code, and leaving snippets of code that are not being used is making the whole process artificially longer when it doesn't need to be. And lastly, and not the least, is good documentation of stated purpose and related permissions. When we launched the minimum permission policy, we heard from developers that they wanted to have a channel of communication with reviewers in order to explain why they needed the permission that we're using. So we've enabled just that. In the new developer dashboard, there's a privacy tab where developers can state, here's what my extension does. And for every permission that are defined in manifest, they get to actually explain why they were requesting that permission and how it actually fits the stated purpose of the extension. So I want to kind of wrap up the idea of policies. And the key points that you should take away is that we cannot solve every problems or every abuse problems just with policies. The same way, we cannot solve every single security problem with Manifest v3 or with UX. It's a combination of all those different efforts together that help us advance the ecosystem and ensure that our users are safe and they trust extensions on the long run. So with that, I hand it back to Devlin for closing words.
Thanks, Alex. So just a couple of different closing thoughts here. First off, thank you so much to eyeo for hosting this. I know that hosting a summit in a pandemic is challenging, and this has actually gone very smoothly, I think. So congratulations on a smooth launch there, and thank you for inviting us back. I wish that we were all somewhere in Europe, in Amsterdam, Germany, or Paris, and having a good time in person where we could see each other. But this is, under the circumstances, I think this really is very well done. And so thank you for that. Also, please do let us repay the favor and host you all remotely at Chrome Dev Summit, which is on December 9th and 10th. There will be some more talks about extensions there, and as well as upcoming changes on the web platform. And I know it's getting late for everyone there in Europe or Asia or elsewhere around the world, so I'll try to be brief. But I do want to talk a little bit about what's important to us. And some of the things that are important to us are you, our developers. We've seen the extension system grow so incredibly over the last few years. We've seen such amazing adoption, seen solving so many different use cases, enabling so many different experiences. And that's all on you. It doesn't matter how good our platform is if there's no content there. It doesn't matter how rich our API surface is if there's no one to use it. And so we are incredibly grateful to you, and you are very important to us. And we want to make sure that we maintain a good, healthy relationship with you, and that we're hearing you out, and that we're listening to you, and that we're enabling you to continue doing the amazing work that you are. Because users love you, and because of you, we are able to benefit as well. And it really is a symbiotic relationship there that we want to make sure we're keeping. Our users are also really important to us. We want to make sure that we're doing right by them. And that's really been one of the focuses of 2020, as David was pointing out. Having that privacy respecting and secure experience is one of the main areas that we're investing in. And we want to make sure that we're embracing user agency, that we're empowering our users to have the experience that they want, that they are the ones in charge. And at Google, we also have this idea of the 3 respects. And the 3 respects are that we should respect the user, respect the opportunity, and respect each other. And we try to really go in on that. And respecting the user is just what I was talking about. Users are so important to us, and we should make sure that we are doing right by them. And part of that is obviously on us for the platform. And we also want to encourage developers to embrace that as well. Respecting the opportunity is that we have this platform that is reaching hundreds of millions of users. We are changing lives, literally. We are enabling so many new things and causing so much good that we should make sure that we're respecting that we're taking it seriously, that we're not squandering this opportunity that we have. And I've been so proud to be able to look back at how we've been able to do that over the last few years. And I want us to continue doing that and really embrace it. And then, of course, there's respect each other. And at Google, we basically sum this up by saying, I don't want to work with jerks. And here, it applies just as well. I think that we've done such a good job of being able to respect each other through this. As Karan mentioned, so much of what we added to declarative net request over the last year was as a direct result of the feedback and constructive critiques and recommendations from the developer community. And I want to make sure that we're keeping that going. And I think that that will make the ecosystem, the platform, and everything just better. And overall, the extension system has grown and evolved. I've been working on extensions since late 2011, so I'm dating myself here. And thinking back over those 9 years, I was working on them before I was at Google, and thinking to how much it's changed. We've gone from a power user feature where I used to tell people, yeah, I work on the extensions part of Chrome, and they say, what? And now it's actually something that is a browser differentiator. It's something that brings people to Chrome or to Firefox or to Edge or to Safari or to Brave or any other browser, and lets them say, this is my browser. This isn't just any browser. I've made it my own. I've curated it. It is my experience. And seeing that amazing evolution has been so fascinating to me. And I'm not unique in this regard. I know that Rob was chiming in on bugs and giving us feedback back in 2012, and I saw those. And I know that Shweetonk, when we first talked, was over at Opera as PM of their extensions team. This is an ecosystem that you really do grow to love, and that we can continue to evolve, and we can continue to make amazing. And we need to make sure that we're keeping it healthy, that we're working together, that we're advancing it and evolving it, that we're adapting for new changes, that we're looking at new ways that we can enable these use cases and new use cases that we can enable to continue to astound our users. And I'm just really excited to be seeing how we do that all together and move forward. So thank you very much. Like I say, I know it's late and I know that we talk a lot. So thank you for bearing with us. We also did want to leave some time for questions and comments if there was any. And it looks like we do have a good chunk there. So.
Yeah, that was really, really great. Thank you for spending some time, and a special shout out to Devlin for the nice background. I appreciate that. And yeah, let's go into some questions. The first one is from Zubair. Can you elaborate on your thinking about privacy from whom? It seems that your threat model mainly considers privacy from extensions and not privacy from Chrome itself. Mainly, ad blocking users trust their ad blocker more than Chrome.
Yeah, sure. I can elaborate more. So you're correct in that our team's recent focus has been on privacy from extensions. There's other efforts at Chrome focusing on different areas of privacy. So our focus is not the only thing that Chrome is doing. But there's one part of the question that I want to clarify on. We have a number of quality ad blockers and extensions in our store. Many of these I use on a regular basis. These are not the extensions that we're focusing in on. As we all know, security is often a cat and mouse game. As security improves, so do the tactics of bad actors. And it's these potentially bad actor extensions that we're protecting against. And so Manifest v2 has a number of different characteristics that are really powerful, but are also dangerous in the wrong hands. For example, the ability to have remotely hosted code. So that's why we're making changes across the board so that that'll make the user experience safer by default. I hope that answers the question.
There's maybe one more point I want to address also in this question is a lot of our work also comes from, I think, our users. I think the shared context that you have between extension and the browser, and you have between apps, between each other in isolation, is also, I think, one of the crux of the issue we're trying to tackle here. And that's something that's very unique about, I think, the concept of browsers extension is that they sort of like inject themselves in the browser themselves. So there's like a level of indirection that other products typically don't have. And I think that's also why there's such an emphasis on this.
Okay, next question is from Hubert. How does one block a request based on HTTP response headers?
Yeah, so that's something that's currently not supported with declarative net requests. So since it's a declarative format, there's some less flexibility involved with the API, but yeah, feel free to file a bug and describe your use case, and we'll definitely see what we can do there. Yeah.
The next one is quite an interesting one. It says, do you have any info on what percentage of users actually used host permissions to allow or deny access to extensions?
Yeah, that's a great question. So thank you for raising that, Tomislav. We do have data, but unfortunately, I don't know if we can share the exact numbers in a public forum. So I need to follow up with some folks about that. I can say that it was very much treated as a power user feature. And that is one of the reasons that we're continuing to invest in it, is that it has seen usage. And we think that it will continue to benefit more people as we continue to bring it more front and center. And so we have seen a change in how many people have been using it since it was buried in the Chrome extensions page and behind a context menu to when we introduced the extensions menu and really called it out. So we think that it is that continued investment and bringing it more to the forefront that will continue to drive that usage and bring that benefit to all users.
Yeah, and I think that bringing it a little bit more front and center is a good move. I think, at least from the extensions community and the ad blocking community, I think that would be a little bit more appreciated. And yeah, that's a move in the right direction, I think. The next question is, CNAME Uncloaking works in uBlock Origin on Firefox and is available in upcoming versions of Brave and Safari. Will the DNR API be kept up to date in instances like these to counter constantly evolving techniques from tracking companies?
So yeah, unfortunately, I don't have much context into CNAME uncloaking. Devlin, do you have any insights here?
For a lot of these types of questions, the best way will probably be to raise them on the forum, where we can go into a lot more of the technical details. In general, we're very amenable to expanding out the declarative NET request API as long as it fits into our overall vision for that. And there's a couple of main pieces to that. One is that it should be able to preserve the privacy of the user. And so we don't want to introduce too many different capabilities that expose user data to that API. And the other is that it should be something that can be declared. It should be a declarative API. And so it should be something where we could specify it in rule form. If there's a way that we can satisfy these different use cases while meeting those different criteria, it's definitely something that we'd be interested in discussing. And the right place for that is there's a Chromium Extensions Google group, which is chromium-extensions@chromium.org. There's also the public bug tracker, and you can file a new bug there at crbug.com/new. And filing a feature request there, raising it in the group would be the best way to get that discussion going, because that's probably not something that we could iron out in the next 8 minutes.
Yeah. The next question is probably something that you touched upon in terms of like when you were talking about policy, but I'll still raise the question, is if there's a minimum number of rules allocated to each extension, how does a global limit discourage multiple extensions being submitted to take advantage of the higher number of rules?
Yeah, so I mean, there's a trade-off. I mean, if the minimum limit is like too much, I mean, extensions can still, in theory, publish multiple extensions to the rule sets, to the web store, and have different rule sets be corresponding to different extensions. We don't want to encourage that. So that's something that we might be able to solve from a policy perspective as well. Yeah.
To add a little bit to that, one of the things that we're aiming for with having a minimum number of rules guaranteed to each extension and having a larger global limit is that we want to reduce the incentive for things like that. And that's also why we added things like multiple static filter lists to enable a lot of the use cases that we were seeing for that, where you might have different lists for different regions, but a user would only have one enabled at a time. We understand that there's still that possibility for abuse, but if you're trying to do that just to get the extra 30K rules when the global limit is already fairly large, we think that the user adoption there will be relatively low, and that it will basically be a marketing balance. And as Karan mentioned, if this is something where we start to see, evil, or not even evil, but extension 1, extension 2, extension 3 that all do the same thing, we might have to react to that with a policy, but we currently don't have plans to.
Okay, the next one is there a chance that there will be a feedback channel for reporting malicious extensions that actually works? From Andre.
That's a very good question. I replied in 2 parts. I think the first thing is we've actually introduced a new channel for this type of support questions, and I can link it probably in the forums, or if you just type one-stop shop in your search engine, you should find it, like Chrome one-stop shop. The other aspect of the question was, I think, the idea of that actually works. And there's 2 things to note, and I touched on that in the slide, was we need very objective facts around the extension actually breaking our policies. So that's one part that's sometimes being missed, is an extension looking like it could be potentially fishy, but it hasn't done anything against policies, is not something we actually would take down. The other aspect is probably around like, what's the turnover of us taking some feedback more seriously, or what's the prioritization here? And in general, like, you may imagine that if you're a malicious actor, a way to make sure that voices are not being heard is to raise yours all over the place. And I think that is something we've seen in general, is like the amount of fake reports we receive is extremely, extremely high.
Yeah, that's sort of like a big challenge. I can imagine. When I was at Opera, we faced some of the similar challenges over there as well, in terms of the huge number of reports. The next question is, how would Chrome's extensions API interface with Chrome's privacy sandbox? will the ad blockers use extensions API be able to block or override Privacy Sandbox advertising or tracking APIs?
Great question, and unfortunately, I don't have a concrete answer here. Because Privacy Sandbox is relatively early in both its implementation as well as still undergoing design considerations. This is one of those aspects that we are considering, is how does this interact with extensions? And when we're designing new Chrome features, new features for the web, that is something that we ask, is how does this interface with the extension API? Are we still providing users with control over their browsing experience to be able to opt in to different experiences? And so this is absolutely something we are looking into to hopefully have more details on as both the extension story and Privacy Sandbox continue to evolve.
Okay, we have a lot of different questions. So I might just shift the rest of the questions to the chat, and I hope that you'll find a little bit more time to respond to a few of those. I'll ask a few final questions regarding the overall state of Manifest v3. I'm sure you are kind of like getting these questions all the time, but any timeline on when we'll see v3 come up, as in browsers in general, or in Chrome in general?
So Chrome follows a rolling release cycle where we're constantly implementing new functionality, and it is available in Canary and Dev and Beta and Stable. We've had what we've been referring to as a developer preview for Manifest v3 for a little over a year now, which has been steadily being fleshed out and providing that greater functionality. We haven't announced an actual date yet for this is when you can upload Manifest v3 extensions in the store, and this is when it is officially done. And that is something that we're looking into, and we'll hopefully be providing details on soon. We have published a public roadmap that basically says Manifest v3, we're targeting Q4 2020. So it's soon. And one of the other pieces there is that it's important to note that we don't view Manifest v3 as something that we will launch and then it's done. We know that there's going to be additional functionality that we add over the course of its evolution. And before we fully remove support for Manifest v2, we're also not going to flip a switch and say, suddenly everything must be v3. And so we're going to be adding those additional capabilities, addressing those needs after the launch of Manifest v3 as well. But yeah, you continue to stay tuned on the Chromium extensions group, as well as the documentation site, things like Chrome Dev Summit. Those are the channels where we would provide more detail as we iron everything out more. Yeah,
and I think when it comes to, taking a look at sunsetting v2, I think it would be really great if you could also listen to some more thoughts from the community. Take a look at what's the state of different ad blockers or different extensions, and how much they're now comfortable with v3. And I look forward to you doing that. And I'm pretty sure that you will be listening to the community. With this, we're kind of out of time now. So I would really like to thank you all for spending time. And once again, would be great if you can take a look at the rest of the questions as well, and reply in the Slack as well. So thank you for joining, and see you around.
Thank you very much for having us. Hopefully we see you next year.
Yeah. Bye. All right. So this concludes our Adblocker Developer Summit for 2020. I would really like to thank all of you. The Slack will still be open, so feel free to continue to talk and interact and ask questions and connect on the Slack channel. We will be posting the talks online in the next few days. So keep in mind and follow eyeo, and you'll see whenever we post it online. I would really like to thank all the speakers for spending their time and energy in sharing their thoughts today. Apart from this, I would really like to thank Nora, who's part of the eyeo branding team and part of the event management team. And I would just really like to thank her for being so organized and working with me throughout the last few months to organize this. I would really like to thank Kirsten, who spent a lot of time in moderating so many talks during this time. Michelle, Celeste, Simon, and everyone else at Fizz Marketing who are the people behind this whole platform. They were great, amazing people, and the platform has been really, really great as well. I would like to thank Suzanne, who started with this journey last year. She unfortunately cannot make it today, but I would really like to thank her. I would like to thank eyeo for this opportunity to actually do the Ad Blocking Developer Summit. And it's really, really great. I think it provides a really great platform for all of us to come together and discuss something which is kind of really needed, and the platform before this didn't really exist. And of course, I would, in the end, thank all of you for joining and sharing your views, asking questions, being active, and in general, just being awesome. So thank you all. And till next time, well, bye-bye.